So in this video tutorial we're going to take these DEMs that we've downloaded and I'm going to use the 5 meter DEM as an example. And we're going to go through how we can display them in a little bit more graphically pleasing way. That's going to involve 3 steps. The first is making a hillshade terrain of these DEMs. The second step is going to be changing the symbology properties of these, and then the third step is to allow easy intercomparison. We're going to make sure that we're using the same symbology and elevation range for each of our different DEMs. So to start with this 5 meter DEM, what I'm going to do is go to Arc Toolbox, and I'm going to go to the hillshade function, and then I'm going to specify that 5 meter DEM as my input DEM. I've actually already calculated hillshades using the same set of steps for the other 3 DEMs. And now I'm going to specify the output raster where I want to put this. I've got a folder here for my 5 meter DEM, and inside of it I've got that geodatabase that we created in the earlier video tutorial. And so what I'm going to do here is add a hillshade to that geodatabase. I'm going to use the default sun angles for where it is on the horizon and how far above the horizon, and then I'm going to use the model shadows because it's going to make a little bit more extreme black and white contrast in the shadows. I'll click OK, and this is going to end up taking a little bit of time. Depending on the speed of your machine, it may take anywhere from something on the order of a minute or 2 up to 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this and we'll come right back as soon as it's done. Okay, so it's finally done creating that hillshade. It dumped it in here up above everything else. If I zoom in to just look at our Big Cottonwood watershed, and I can see the hillshade, and in comparison to just the DEM, that hillshade really makes it a lot easier for me to see the topography. What I'm going to do to make it so I can see both the elevations and the and that hillshade is I'm going to drag that hillshade layer down underneath the DEM. Now it's on, but I can't see it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the properties of the 5 meter DEM, and I'm going to choose a color ramp that's a little more typical for an elevation data set. You can use whatever you want. Actually, I might use a slightly different one here. Let's see. I'm going to use that guy, which you may not have, but doesn't matter. You can use any one that you want. Then I'm going to switch to the display tab, and this is going to allow me to see the hillshade underneath by changing the transparency of the DEM that's on top of it. And so now I can see both the elevation values, and by the way, if you want a color ramp like this, you can make custom color ramps under Customize. And then you would go to Style Manager, and you can expand out your user profile, go to color ramps, and then you would right click in here and make a new color ramp. Just a tangent. But anyway, here we can still see our elevation values nicely, as well as the hillshade. So let's say I wanted to apply the same, I wanted to do the same thing for some of these other data sets. Let's just bring up our 10 meter data set. And so I've got a hillshade here and a DEM on top. It's got a different color ramp, but I could change it to the same color ramp as what I used in this other one. And when I look at these two, if I bring up my effects toolbar and I put the 10 meter on top and use this swiping tool, it's not working. So the reason that wasn't working is because I didn't have the 5 meter DEM on. So now when I have that 5 meter DEM on, and so if I swipe and pull off the 10 meter DEM on top, it's hard to intercompare these two. I can see some differences, but a big part of the differences that I'm seeing are coming from the color ramps being different. So the question is, why are those color ramps different? We can explain that in a couple of ways. One is that the elevation ranges on these are slightly off. The other one is that the overall histograms or distributions of these data, if I were to look at, say, a histogram for the Salt Lake DEM, just going to take a second here, versus a histogram of the 5 meter DEM, which we were also looking at. If I plot up one of those, the two histograms are totally different. So part of the reason that the histograms are different is because the extents of these two data sets are different. If you recall, when I zoom out and I look at all of Salt Lake County, I've got these 4 tiles comprising this 5 meter DEM, and if I turn on the 10 meter DEM, what I will see is that this has a very different extent. So they have very different elevation distributions because of those different extents. One way to deal with this is to clip them down to the exact same boundary so that they're working with the same thing. And we'll talk about how you can clip that in the next video tutorial. The other part of this is that if we went and looked at this, bearing in mind they have different histograms, and then we're using a stretched color ramp, the method we're using to stretch that color ramp is standard deviations. And so what it's going to do is it's going to stretch that color ramp based very much on the standard deviations it sees within that histogram. Okay, and so what we can do to make sure that these things look a little bit more alike, if I zoom back in to Big Cottonwood Watershed, and I'm going to go to the properties of, I'm going to turn off the 10 meter one and go to the properties on the symbology settings, and instead of using standard deviations, what I'm going to use is minimum maximum. And so it's going to go between the high value of 3501 and the 1278, and it's just going to stretch it linearly between those two. And so when I do that, I get a slightly different, notice there's less white in here, a slightly different color scheme for my elevations. Now if I want to use that exact same color scheme up here, I can, and I can go to the properties of my 10 meter DEM. First I should turn it on. So I'll go to the properties of my 10 meter DEM, and what I'll do is I'm going to import the settings from my 5 meter DEM layer. When I do that, it's going to change this to maximum min and use the same elevation range. Notice here these are the actual values, and then notice that the actual high and low are a little different. So use the same range as this other one. When I hit OK, now it's changed a lot too, and if I switch back here to having my 10 meter one on top, and I use this effects toolbar, I can see differences, but now the differences are really down to the resolution, and the color scheme is very much the same. So that's a really, really important couple of steps there in how you can manipulate the display settings to make sure that the color ramps are the same between raster data sets, so that you can truly compare apples and oranges. What do I mean? So you can truly compare apples and apples. If I don't change those symbology settings, then when I'm looking at these differences, some of the differences I see are due to real differences between the data, and some are just simply down to display settings. So in summary, what we've done is we've taken a couple of, or we've taken with one example from our 5 meter DEM, we've taken that original digital elevation model, we computed a hillshade from it, we used that hillshade so that we could see underneath, we could see the terrain, make the terrain pop out a little bit more vividly. We still wanted to see the elevation data, so we've turned on the elevation layers on top of it. applied a color ramp that was typical for using in DEMs, and made the DEM itself transparent so we could see the terrain underneath. And then finally we adjusted the color ramp's display settings so that we could easily intercompare different DEMs, different rasters of the same area here. And that concludes this particular video tutorial.